The trouble began on a warm Saturday morning when the sun cast a bright shimmer across the neighborhood, lighting up every roof, lawn, and mailbox with almost theatrical clarity. The houses in the Oak Ridge Bluffs community were identical in design, layout, even choice of shrubbery. Everything looked intentionally uniform, like a model neighborhood frozen in brochure perfection. It was this strict sameness that the HOA valued more fiercely than anything else, and it was the quiet pressure behind every decision they made. For years, I had managed to blend into their world well enough, keeping the yard trimmed, maintaining the standard beige exterior, and following every rule written or implied. But the moment I drove home in my new citrus orange hatchback, the spell of compliance shattered. I hadn't chosen the car because it was loud, or rebellious, or attention-grabbing. I chose it because cars in that color were hard to steal, easy to spot in parking lots, and, frankly, because it made me happy. But happiness had never been a consideration for Oak Ridge Bluffs. The HOA valued predictability, conformity, and a curated aesthetic that looked like a catalog had swallowed the neighborhood whole. So when the car was parked neatly in my driveway for less than 12 hours, I should have expected the email that arrived the next morning. The message came with the sterile politeness that only an HOA board member could produce. Hidden under layers of formality was a threat. My car violated the community's color harmony guidelines, a document I had never heard of, referencing regulations that had never been enforced, invoked, or even mentioned by any resident I knew. They claimed the color was disruptive, non-compliant, and unapproved. They issued a warning that future violations could incur fines. And they ended the message with the infuriating phrase that clearly wasn't a suggestion. Immediate corrective action is expected. The idea that a car parked on private property could be considered a violation felt absurd. But absurdity was not new in this neighborhood. Years before, a family had been forced to remove a wind chime because its sound allegedly interfered with outdoor serenity. Another resident had been fined for having a holiday wreath that the board deemed excessively ornate. Oak Ridge Bluffs didn't simply enforce rules, it invented them when convenient. At first, I tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps this was just a misunderstanding. Perhaps they sent the message to the wrong person. But the more I read it, the more obvious it became. They wanted the car gone, and they believed they had the power to make it happen. So I sent a polite but firm email requesting clarification, asking for documentation of the rules they claimed I had violated. The reply came only hours later and offered neither clarification nor documentation, just a notice that a fine of $200 would be applied if the car remained visible from the street. By the end of the week, it was the speed and confidence of their response that unsettled me. It was clear they expected no resistance. They assumed, like many residents before me, that I would bend, pay, or remove whatever offended their sense of order. And for a moment, I wondered if I should just comply. The neighborhood was known for being difficult, and the board was notorious for its persistence. But as I stood in my driveway, staring at the car that brought a bit of color into a world of monotony, something inside me hardened. I refused to let a small group of power-drunk board members dictate the color of my personal property. It wasn't until I spoke to my cousin Marcus that the situation shifted from irritation to strategy. Marcus wasn't just family. He was a seasoned attorney who specialized in property and municipal law. When I described the situation to him over the phone, he didn't react with disbelief the way I expected. Instead, he reacted with amusement, the kind that suggested he'd encountered this kind of petty overreach many times before. He told me to forward him the emails and any community documents I had access to. Within an hour, he called me back with a tone that was noticeably more serious. The so-called color harmony guidelines, he said, existed only in a vague, informal sense. They were referenced in a few documents about exterior home paint colors, but nowhere did they include vehicles. Nowhere did they grant the HOA authority over personal property parked on residential driveways. And nowhere did they justify the imposition of fines for such matters. In Marcus's words, the board wasn't just wrong. They were attempting to enforce regulations they had no legal basis for. Worse, they were doing it in writing. Armed with this information, I decided not to respond immediately to the HOA. I let them send their warnings and reminders, each message more curt than the last. Their impatience was visible in every line. They assumed silence meant surrender. Meanwhile, Marcus was gathering documents, reviewing bylaws, and preparing responses that would corner them into confronting their own overreach. The board escalated quickly. Within a few days, they sent a formal violation notice printed on letterhead, asserting that my refusal to remove or conceal the car constituted continued noncompliance. And in a subtle but calculated move, they copied several neighbors on the message. It was a classic HOA tactic, public pressure disguised as communication. By looping in others, they hoped to shame me or encourage social friction. What they didn't realize was that several neighbors had already approached me privately, expressing disbelief that the board would waste its energy on something so trivial. A few even admitted they found the car refreshing, a welcome break from the endless rows of neutrals. Despite their supportive words, the pressure still built. There's something uniquely unsettling about receiving official letters accusing you of wrongdoing when you've done nothing wrong. And in Oak Ridge Bluffs, the HOA's tone carried the echo of authority, even when its foundation was hollow. Every envelope felt heavier than the last. Every line felt more accusatory. And with every passing day, it became clearer that the board was not merely enforcing rules. They were asserting control. Marcus, however, remained unfazed. He told me to stay calm, to trust the process, and to let the board dig themselves deeper with every action they took. And dig they did. Their final move came in the form of an intent to fine notice dated for the following week. It claimed that failure to comply would result in recurring daily fines until the car was removed or appropriately modified. A phrase that made Marcus laugh out loud when he read it, as if they expected me to repaint the vehicle to match their color palette. By the end of the week, the stage was set. The board believed they had cornered me, and I had given them no indication otherwise. They expected obedience. Instead, what they were about to receive was the full weight of the legal system they had so casually tried to weaponize. The battle over a car color was about to become something much larger than any of them realized. And as the deadline approached, the quiet tension that had settled over the situation began to tighten, ready to snap. The morning the fines were scheduled to begin, the neighborhood felt unusually still, as if the entire community was waiting for something to happen. The air was crisp, unmoving, and almost symbolic, like Oak Ridge Bluffs itself was holding its breath. Even the usual dog walkers passed by more quietly than normal, glancing at my bright orange car with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. It had become a landmark of sorts, the spark that lit a powder keg beneath the rigid surface of the community. The HOA board, confident in their escalating threat of fines, was prepared to enforce their invented rule. What they didn't know was that Marcus was already several steps ahead of them. The first official fine, $200, labeled as a daily aesthetic violation, arrived by email at 7:03 a.m., punctually delivered like a clock chime that announced the beginning of a war. Attached was a form that looked intimidating at first glance. Columns, dates, reference numbers, and a section listing corrective actions not yet taken. Beneath it was a terse message reminding me that additional fines would stack each day until compliance was achieved. They considered this a form of pressure, an inevitable force that would corral me into submission. But their confidence came from a belief that they operated above challenge, a misconception that was about to crumble. Marcus instructed me not to reply. Instead, he drafted a formal cease and desist letter addressed to the board, asserting that their actions were extralegal and constituted harassment under state property law. He wrote with precision and authority, citing clauses the board had likely never bothered to read. He listed precedents, referenced procedural requirements, and pointed out not only the baselessness of their claim, but also the liability they exposed themselves to by issuing unauthorized fines. It was devastating in its calm thoroughness. He sent copies of the letter to the board members individually, their general HOA inbox, the community management company overseeing the neighborhood, and, most significantly, our county's regulatory oversight office for private associations. The board received it at 9:17 a.m. Only 3 minutes later, one of the board members began driving slowly up and down the street, pausing in front of my house each time. The movement was subtle at first, but over the next half hour, another board member joined in, making the behavior impossible to ignore. They were trying to maintain the illusion of control, the visual presence of authority. But there was a jitteriness to their actions now, an agitation that made it clear the letter had rattled them. By midday, the board had sent out a clarification email to the entire community, announcing that they were reviewing concerns brought to their attention regarding vehicle color standards. They insisted they were acting in accordance with long-standing expectations, a phrase that attempted to mask the fact that no such standards existed. Their message, though cloaked in corporate politeness, reeked of defensiveness. It was an attempt to maintain face while simultaneously trying to gather support from the neighborhood. Their attempt backfired. Residents began replying to the thread, not privately but publicly, with comments visible to the entire list, asking where these standards were documented, why they had never been enforced before, and why the board was suddenly targeting one specific homeowner. Others chimed in with stories of previous petty enforcement attempts, all of which made the board look increasingly unhinged. The very transparency they sought to use as a weapon now turned against them. Marcus observed all of this with a calm, strategic patience. He advised me not to engage with any of the neighbors' comments or the board's messages. He wanted the record to show that the board was escalating without provocation, responding only to their own sense of threatened authority. That afternoon, the board finally broke their silence in a direct email to me. The tone had changed noticeably. No longer assertive, no longer threatening. The message was full of vague language about ongoing review and temporary suspension of fines pending internal evaluation. They hoped, clearly, to de-escalate without admitting fault. But Marcus insisted we treat their email not as a retreat but as a delay tactic. He explained that organizations like this often pulled back only to regroup and strike again later, hoping the resident would relax their guard. He prepared a second letter, this one less patient. It demanded that all fines and violation notices be formally withdrawn, that the board issue a written correction acknowledging their overreach, and that the incident be recorded as an example of improper enforcement within the community's official minutes. It was a direct hit to the board's pride, and precisely because of that, it was necessary. The board responded by calling an emergency meeting for that evening that I didn't attend, but several neighbors informed me afterward that the meeting was chaotic. The board was split internally. 2 members wanted to drop the issue entirely and avoid further trouble. Another insisted that I had provoked the situation by purchasing a deliberately disruptive vehicle. A fourth claimed they had every right to regulate anything visible from the street. The debate reportedly escalated to raised voices, accusations of poor judgment, and concerns about liability exposure. It was the first time many residents had ever seen the board lose its composure so publicly. The next morning, I received a notice, this one by physical mail, informing me that the HOA had voted to uphold the fines after all. They included a formal citation stating that community aesthetics were under threat and that I was being willfully non-compliant. The tone was desperate, almost frantic, as if they believed that doubling down would preserve their authority. It was the clearest sign yet that they didn't understand the gravity of the situation they had created for themselves. Marcus's reaction was immediate and controlled. He drafted a complaint packet for the state regulatory office, complete with timelines, screenshots of emails, scanned letters, and verbatim copies of HOA bylaws proving the board had no authority to enforce the rule they invented. The packet was over 30 pages long and left nothing to interpretation. It accused the board of harassment, misuse of association power, procedural violations, and unlawful fines. He submitted it that same day. 2 days later, the Oversight Office responded with a notice that they would be launching a formal investigation. That was when everything changed. Neighbors began talking. Some were thrilled that the board was finally being challenged. Others worried about what the investigation would uncover. The board's behavior grew increasingly erratic. They started monitoring the street more frequently, issuing unrelated reminders about trash bins and lawn care, and holding sudden meetings behind closed doors. They believed they were still in control, but the panic showed through the cracks as the days passed. The bright orange car remained in my driveway, untouched, unhidden, and shining like a beacon of quiet defiance. The fines they attempted to issue no longer had any effect. They were suspended by the investigation. The board's power was shrinking, and they knew it. But the tipping point had not yet arrived. That moment, the one that would eventually expose their hypocrisy publicly and permanently, was still coming. And when it arrived, it would be far bigger than a dispute over a car. The investigation began quietly, with only a short notice from the regulatory office confirming their intent to audit the HOA's practices. But its impact rippled through the community like a slow-moving storm. At first, the board attempted to minimize the severity of what was happening. They sent out carefully worded updates to residents, claiming that the inquiry was routine, a standard review to ensure best practices. But the tone of their messages shifted noticeably as the investigators began requesting documents. First a few bylaws, then meeting minutes, then financial records, and finally, the entire archive of violation notices issued in the past 5 years. The board had not anticipated the scope of scrutiny. They expected a slap on the wrist at most, some minor procedural correction. Instead, they found themselves drowning in requests they couldn't ignore or delay. Every email from the oversight office seemed to unravel another thread of control they had once held so tightly. Their authority, built more on intimidation than legitimacy, was now being examined under a spotlight they couldn't dim. Neighbors started noticing the tension immediately. The board members who once patrolled the streets with their clipboards now drove by with rigid posture and vacant stares, no longer waving or acknowledging residents. The president of the HOA, a man who once spoke with an air of invincible confidence, appeared more withdrawn, as if the weight of every questionable decision he had ever made now pressed visibly against him. At night, lights stayed on late at the homes of several board members, a sign that they were poring over paperwork or drafting desperate defenses. Marcus observed all this from a distance with the calm satisfaction of someone who knew the process was unfolding exactly as it should. He didn't interfere, didn't comment, didn't provoke. He simply monitored the responses from the oversight office, noting each escalation with quiet approval. The system, slow though it could be, was doing its work. Within 2 weeks, the audit revealed far more than a made-up rule about vehicle colors. The investigators uncovered discrepancies in the board's record-keeping, missing minutes from multiple meetings, fines that were never formally approved, and several instances where penalties had been applied inconsistently and without proper vote. They found evidence of selective enforcement as well, with certain homeowners receiving warnings for minor issues while others, particularly friends and relatives of board members, were allowed violations without consequence. There were even instances of financial irregularities, small but suspicious expenses labeled as administrative costs and miscellaneous reimbursements, the kind that suggested someone had been using HOA funds as a personal convenience. All of this became public knowledge when the Oversight Office released a mid-audit summary to the community, a step they only took when they believed residents had a right to know what was happening. The summary was brief but devastating. It laid out the key findings, the potential violations of state law, and the possible consequences the board could face. It ended with a clear, concise statement that the attempted fines imposed on me had no legal basis and should be considered void. The neighborhood reacted swiftly. Residents who had long remained silent about the board's oversteps now spoke openly, emboldened by the confirmation that they had been mistreated. Stories poured out, fines for slightly discolored grass, threats over holiday decorations, disputes about mailboxes, and claims of favoritism. The board, once feared, became the subject of scrutiny and criticism at every turn. Some members attempted to defend themselves publicly, insisting that they had acted in the community's best interest. But the evidence against them overshadowed their excuses. Each attempt to justify their behavior only reinforced the perception that they were desperately grasping for control. The final blow came during a mandatory meeting called by the Oversight Office, held in the community's clubhouse. Attendance was required for all board members and optional for residents. The room, however, filled to capacity. Word had spread quickly, and neighbors who had never attended a meeting before now gathered in anticipation of a reckoning. The officials conducted the meeting with measured professionalism. They laid out the findings calmly, each point hitting the room like a quiet hammer. The board had overstepped its authority. It had violated procedural rules. It had imposed unauthorized fines. It had shown patterns of selective enforcement. And most damning of all, it had attempted to punish a homeowner, me, based on a non-existent rule, an act the investigators labeled as arbitrary and coercive. When the officials concluded, the room was silent. The board members sat stiffly, their faces pale, their expressions a mixture of humiliation and disbelief. One of them attempted to speak, but the official cut him off with a simple statement. Further discussion would occur in private. The rest of the meeting was adjourned. By the end of the week, the board announced its collective resignation. Their message was thinly disguised as a voluntary transition to ensure a positive environment, but everyone knew it was a forced exit. New elections were scheduled. A temporary management group stepped in to handle administrative duties. And for the first time in years, the community felt lighter, freer, and strangely optimistic. As for the fines they attempted to issue me, they were not just dismissed, but formally expunged from the community records. The Oversight Office instructed the HOA to issue a written apology, acknowledging that the violation had never been legitimate and that their handling of the matter had been improper. The letter arrived in my mailbox 2 days later. Its tone was formal, subdued, and pointedly lacking the arrogance that once defined everything they sent. Marcus read it with a satisfied nod before filing it away neatly, a small trophy of a battle won. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. The tension faded. People planted flowers without fear of being reprimanded. Children played in yards that had once been scrutinized. Conversations grew warmer, more open, and the bright orange car remained in my driveway, a symbol not of defiance anymore, but of perseverance. The new HOA board, elected with overwhelming support, reached out to me early in their term. They explained that they wanted to rebuild trust, to apply rules fairly, and to ensure that no resident would ever again face the kind of harassment I had endured. They thanked me, indirectly, for standing my ground, for refusing to accept an abuse of authority simply because it arrived in official-looking envelopes. Life in Oak Ridge Bluffs settled into a more peaceful rhythm. The houses still looked the same, the lawns still trimmed neatly, the streets still quiet and orderly. But beneath that familiar appearance, something fundamental had changed. The power that once ruled through intimidation had dissolved. In its place was a community that understood the value of fairness, transparency, and accountability. And sometimes, when the sunlight hit my car just right, casting a bright reflection across the otherwise muted neighborhood, I remembered how the entire conflict had started with a simple color. A color they tried to erase. A color they thought they could regulate. A color that ultimately exposed everything they had tried to hide. It was almost poetic that something so bright had revealed the shadows lurking beneath the surface.